What's up guys, welcome back to the Green Hulk Garage. Today we're going to be doing even more work to this Sea-Doo 325. Nothing too crazy today, we are just installing upgraded valve springs and retainers on this. Now by the time you see this video, we got less than a week left for our first Mudbug group ride of the year, and I refuse to show up to my own group ride with a relatively slow Sea-Doo. Now so far, all I've got installed on this is a custom homemade intake because I'm waiting on the Riva Racing intake to become available, a rear exit exhaust, the fuel tech system, and a custom pitch Solus impeller. And with just that, I ran 85.3 miles per hour on GPS, 87 on the dash at only 8,500 RPM with an absolute full tank of fuel in it. These things are really sensitive to fuel and weight. With less than a half a tank of gas, I guarantee you it would have been a mile an hour or two faster than that. But at 8,500 RPM, I'm a little nervous about revving it that high. Now these new Sea-Doo 325s come with upgraded valve springs and retainers from the factory, but I personally am not going to trust that. No one has really figured out the safe limit, and I'm not going to be a guinea pig. So we're going to pull this apart and get upgraded springs and retainers installed today. And of course, my spring and retainer of choice is going to be these Calas Performance springs and retainers. The reason that I'm going to install these particular springs and retainers is because I am going to install this Calas Performance camshaft in the ski. Now, it's very important that you match your spring and retainer setup with the cam that you choose to use. These springs and retainers are going to be safe for the Calas Cam, so 100% go with these if you're going to go with a Calas camshaft. Now, if you look at this cam, you can see it's not brand new. Neither are these. I just pulled these out of one of the spare engines I had laying around with maybe 1 hour of runtime on it. This is still going to be his billet cam and low hour springs and retainers that were going to be installed on this. It's crunch time for Mudbug. I don't have time to wait for shipping, so this is definitely a faster solution. If you notice, we do have this rocker arm here on the workbench. This is the older style cast rocker arm. But when I do have the engine apart to install the springs and retainers, I am going to compare the weight of this older style cast rocker arm to the new forged style rocker arm. The forged rocker arms are going to be much stronger than this, and I'm curious to see if there's a weight difference because the springs and retainers do have to control the weight of this rocker arm as well. So I'm curious to see if the new one is going to be any heavier. Of course, that's going to affect springs and retainers, but if the weight is pretty similar, then it shouldn't be a problem. Now, with the entire valve cover removed, we have access to the rocker shaft, the rocker arms, and the springs and retainers, and the camshaft is down in there. Now, we do have to remove the rocker shaft and rocker arms in order to replace both the springs and retainers, and later on the camshaft. It's only 6 bolts holding them down. You will need an E10 torque socket to get these off, and these bolts are also stretch bolts, meaning they are not reusable. Some people will measure them and reuse them, but I will never recommend that anyone does that. These bolts are so cheap, it just makes sense to replace them. I wouldn't want to risk not replacing them. So definitely get these on order when you plan to do springs and retainers or a camshaft change. To get this off, we do have to pull out these spark plug tubes. They just pop right on in there. And you can remove the rocker shaft now to change out the springs and retainers. Now that the rocker shaft and rocker arms are off, I've got a food scale here that we're going to weigh these on. So the old cast style rocker arms are 106 grams and the new ones are 113. So that's a 7-gram difference. That's just showing you that these are denser and stronger than the cast rocker arms. And I don't think a 7-gram difference is going to make a difference as far as needing different springs and retainers. Definitely a denser material and stronger rocker arm than the old ones. Now with this all out of the way, we're going to go ahead and get the springs and retainers installed. To swap out these springs and retainers, we're going to use the Riva Racing valve compression tool. You'll have 2 of these, that little line down here. You want to line this up with the camshaft. So that one will go here and another one will go on the opposite side. And there's a tool to compress each valve spring. So we can get the keepers off the valve, swap the valve spring retainer, and reinstall them. Now you do have to pull the spark plugs out and pressurize each cylinder. It comes with a tool to do that, but you only want to do one at a time. And the reason for that, let's say you pull all the spark plugs out, you now have a hole here going directly down into the cylinder, a hole there going down directly into the cylinder, and of course this one will be filled with a tool to pressurize this. If you drop one of these keepers down into these holes, you're not getting it out without taking the engine apart. So it's better to just leave these in while this is pressurized, then reinstall this spark plug, move on to this one, and so on. And because of that, there's also these little holes down here in the cylinder head. I like to fill all of this with some shop rags just to plug these holes up. And I'll also fill this in just so if I do drop a keeper, there's no chance of it falling into a hole and me needing to take this engine apart. Other than that, this is a really straightforward install and easy to do if you take your time. Being that I'm a little pressed for time, I just decided that since I've got this apart to do the springs and retainers, we're just going to put the Calas Cam in it at the same time. Now, for those of you that don't know really what a camshaft is and how it works, the simplest way that I could put that to you is these little lobes here dictate when the valves open and close, which is letting air into the cylinders and out of the cylinders. And aftermarket camshafts change the valve events, change how much the valves open, meaning there's more lift. The valves physically open more with an aftermarket cam. So what you're doing is you're getting more air into the combustion chamber and getting higher cylinder pressures, which in turn makes more power. And out of all the camshafts that I use, my favorite one has been the Calas Performance camshaft. It really makes a lot of torque. It's really snappy, and I'm never disappointed with the outcome of how it performs. It'll be much better than this stock cam. And what I really like about Sea-Doo is how easy they make installing camshaft. I do a lot of work on Sea-Doos and Yamahas require a lot more skill to do because you have to time the engine. You have to use dial indicator tools to do that. It's a little more complicated. If you own the Sea-Doo specialty tools to do this job, you can literally train a 3-year-old to do this. The first tool that we're going to need is this cam locking tool. So you're going to spin the motor over till it's at top dead center. You can do that by the supercharger with the spark plugs out, so the motor's not going to make any compression. Turns over really easy by the supercharger. And once we get these marks here aligned with the top of the cylinder head, we'll be able to put this in. Now, this is just going to be a reference for now to get us very close to top dead center. There's still a little bit of wiggle room here, and then that's where we have to come down here. We do have to take the intake manifold off, and if you see this plug right here, we're going to remove this, and this is going to allow us to lock the crank. Now I'll shine a flashlight down in here and reference that there is in fact a hole at this point to get it perfectly aligned and lock the crank, and from there, the motor's time. You're at top dead center. You don't have to worry about this whole assembly moving, and it'll be very easy to pull the cams in and out. One other thing that we're gonna have to do, and you gotta move some of these wires out of the way, is this plug here is for the timing chain tensioner. We do have to remove that to get the cam sprocket off, swap the cams out, and reinstall it. Once we have this all locked at top dead center, we're going to need to remove the cam sprocket so this camshaft can slide out, and we'll slide the new one in. Now there's a little plate down in here, and you do have to be very careful with that plate that you can see here. Behind that is the 3 bolts holding on this cam sprocket. Now, so you do have to pull this plate off. It's just gonna snap in here, and I'll just pull it out with my finger, but we have to be very careful not to drop it down into the cylinder head. You drop it down in here, it's going to the bottom of the motor, and the engine will have to come out, taken apart to get that out. It's not something you wanna do, so be very careful when you're working around here, taking stuff in and out, and that also goes for the 3 bolts holding on the cam sprocket. Right here, we do have this little retaining plate for the cam. This is what keeps it aligned, keeps it from going back and forth. So be sure to put this back where it goes. You're not going to get the cam out without taking this out, and it's also not going to be in properly if you don't put it back. So that's a really important piece there. So with that said, we're good to go. We're going to start taking these plugs out, lock the crank, and swap out these cams. Now that I have all of this taken apart, I still have the cam locked, and you can see down here I have the crank locked and the timing chain tensioner out. So this cam is ready to be slid out and the new one slid back in. When you take the sprocket off, you always want to have something on standby to put through the chain, because if the chain falls through, that's going to be another mess in itself. You don't want to drop the chain down in there. Always keep the chain up. We're going to take the locking pin out, slide this old cam out, and slide the Calas cam in. Now when putting in the new cam, you can't put it in dry. If you put it in dry when you start it up, it's not going to be lubricated, and you're going to have metal on metal contact. So either use some engine assembly lube, or what I always typically do is just put a lot of oil on the cam, make sure it's all lubed and spinning nice and freely, and put it back together like that. Now we have the Calas cam in here. Cam is locked in position, crank is locked in position, and as far as cam timing, that's just how it goes. There's no fancy degreeing involved. You don't have to advance or retard it any. Calas designed this to where you lock the cam and you lock the crank, and you're going to be set. Now you can see that I've got the sprocket on here. The timing marks on the sprocket are leaning a little bit to the exhaust side. That's totally normal, and that's exactly how you want to be. But I do not have these bolts tightened all the way down. There's still a little movement here in the sprocket, and that's because we need to put the tensioner in. When we put the tensioner in, it's going to pull it over a little bit, and then we'll torque it down. Here's the tensioner. This side is going to go in towards the timing chain, and this side is going to go in towards the plug holding it in. Now this is a hydraulic tensioner, so we do have to relieve the pressure in this before we reinstall it. Otherwise it's going to be too tight and more than likely stretch and break your timing chain. And to relieve the pressure in it, you just got to stick something small down in the hole here on the top. You could use a little screwdriver. I just use one of these tiny little Allen wrenches, and we could squeeze it and relieve the pressure in it. The oil will come squirting out, and you want to do this until it's nice and free and you're able to collapse it all the way with just your finger. After that, we'll reinstall it into the ski and tighten everything down. This is all nice and free now. There's no oil left in it. I could easily collapse it. So we'll slide that in there like that, put some Loctite on the plug, tighten that down. Then we'll tighten down the sprocket bolts, and I also have Loctite on those as well. Then we'll be able to pull out the cam locking tool and the crank locking tool. I'll also put some Loctite on this plug when reinstalling it. After that, this job's pretty much done. You just need to reinstall everything you took off to get to this point. We can now move on to putting the rocker shaft back on. You can see all these rocker shaft bolts here. Again, these are a one-time use bolt. You have to replace them because they're stretch bolts, so you also do not want to use Loctite on them. And you do have to torque them in a specific order. Now, the first thing I'm going to do when getting this on is I'm going to get this motor at top dead center, and you can see here we've got the timing marks aligned with the top of the cylinder head, and the easiest way to do that is just to spin the engine over by the supercharger with the spark plugs out. And that's going to ensure that all the valves are closed, so we're not putting any load on this shaft. When installing it, it's going to go down evenly. And the torque sequence for this is going to be this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. You want to start on the inside and work your way out. Think of applying a decal. If you wanted to lay it down flat, you've got to start in the middle and work outwards. And we're going to do this in 3 steps. So we're first going to torque these bolts to 7 foot-pounds. The second pass, we're going to torque them to 14 foot-pounds. And the third pass, we're gonna add 90 degrees. Now this is where a digital torque wrench really comes in handy because it will measure that 90 degrees for you. If you don't have a digital torque wrench, 90 degrees is a right angle. It's not too hard to figure that out. So we're going to go ahead and torque these down and put the valve cover on. So we're out here testing the Calas Cam, and aside from that, the only thing that I've done to this is a homemade 90-degree intake, which I honestly don't like because it's pulling from the hottest point of the hull. But I'm waiting on the Reva intake to become available, but that'll do for the time being. Rear exit exhaust and a custom pitched soulless impeller. And aside from that, the density altitude today is around 2,000 feet, which is really not good for horsepower. You lose about 3% per 1,000 feet, so we're losing 6% of horsepower than what we typically see. It's a really gloomy day, it's muggy, so we're down on power already right off the bat because of that. Earlier in the month when I was testing, we actually had a negative DA of like 100 feet. So we're already down about 6% of horsepower. But with that, by adding the cam, we still gained roughly 200 RPM, which is substantial considering the horsepower loss that we have to deal with today. Because of the custom pitch soulless impeller that I have in here, it's really heavy. It's a 1420. That's extremely heavy compared to what most people run. The most common impellers are 1318, so already 2 degrees more pitch there, yet this is still turning 8,600 RPM, down on power because of bad weather and with a really heavy impeller installed. Now that 8,600 RPM equaled 86 mile per hour on GPS. That's not dash speed, that's true GPS speed. Your dash reads roughly 3% higher than true GPS, and we saw 86 today. So that'd be about 88-ish on the dash. Aside from speed, one of the biggest things with this cam that I noticed was the acceleration. So if we look down here at this data log, you can see a whole shot that I did. I pulled just over 1.2 Gs at the peak, which is absolutely incredible for the little that's been done to the ski. And if you look at our RPM curve right here, it did not cavitate. It almost did. It came to a peak, then came back down, but that's really what I like to see. That's an absolute perfect hole shot. You're right on the edge of cavitation, and you're going to get the best launch possible. The Sea-Doo it hole shot's absolutely incredible, and the Calas Cam on top of that, it's pulling extremely hard compared to the stock cam. Now, we did only gain 200 RPM, but we've got bad weather, and the 325 comes with an upgraded cam already. So you're not going to see the same gains that you would on 300, but we still see a decent gain here. Now at the peak, even with this bad weather, we're only at 8,600 RPM right here. So ideally, I would take pitch out of the impeller to bring the RPM up, but instead of that, because I really like how this impeller behaves, every 100 RPM seems to be equaling about 1 mile per hour, considering we turned 8,600, ran 86 on GPS. So we're just going to add more horsepower. We're going to go home tonight, pull the supercharger apart, install some Fizzle prototype supercharger impellers, and we're going to hit this thing even harder than what we're at now. So aside from all this, I did do some testing seat on versus seat off because I want to play with my hull ventilation mod. I'll make a run with the seat on, then remove the seat, and if I gain RPM by doing that, then I just don't have enough hull ventilation. I need to go home and address that with more hole cuts and vents on the ski. But with that, I did get some really good clips of this thing flying by. It sounds absolutely insane with the seat off. The supercharger is just screaming, so I'm sure you guys are going to enjoy that. Thanks for watching this video. I know this one was a longer one, but a lot of good info and a lot of good testing was done today. So we're gonna go home, put the Fizzle supercharger impeller in this, hit this thing with more boost, more horsepower, of course, more speed. So be on the lookout for that. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch y'all in the next episode.